from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thank you for your testimony and thank you for your public service. Last week in my district and my hometown of El Paso, Texas, a domestic violent extremist was sentenced to 90 consecutive life terms for a horrific attack he carried out on my community on August 3rd, 2019. On that day, he confessed that he drove over 10 hours from his community in East Texas to mine in order to slaughter Mexicans and immigrants. And before he walked into that Walmart, he published his screed online, and he used some of the same ugly xenophobic rhetoric that I hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle use. And then he walked into that Walmart with an automatic style weapon and began shooting indiscriminately. He killed 23 people, injured dozens more, and my community remains profoundly impacted by that attack. And the victims and the survivors and the loved ones still live with profound pain and trauma. What is the FBI doing, Director Wray, in response to racially motivated domestic terrorism?
Well, first, let me say I feel your pain. I actually visited the Walmart crime scene shortly after the attack and spent time with our folks on the ground who were processing the crime scene in blistering heat in the parking lot there, and obviously got briefed by the investigative team and met with our local partners, and obviously it was a horrific, tragic event, and the individual stories about some of the individual victims stick with me to this day. As to the broader phenomenon of racially motivated violent extremism, we have done a number of things. We elevated it to a national threat priority back in the summer of 2019, I believe it was, which means that it is squarely in scope of all of our joint terrorism task forces and treated as a priority at the top level. That's our highest level of priority. We also have engaged, we created a domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell, and you might wonder what's the point of that. Well, what we found was that sometimes the same acts of violence could either be called a hate crime or could be called an act of domestic violent extremism. And in the way the FBI is structured, the first is treated by our criminal investigative division, the second is is focused on by our counterterrorism division. And by bringing the two subject matter experts together, we could make sure that we are not letting anything slip through the cracks, and more importantly, we can be proactive in thinking ahead. And that same fusion cell, for example, was then very important in us identifying and preventing a potentially devastating attack against a synagogue outside of Colorado. And it was really one of the first times in recent memory that a hate crimes prosecution was able to be preventative. All too often, unfortunately, those cases are brought after there's a horrific attack. So we were very proud of disrupting that plot.
Thank you so much, Director Wray. I'm also very curious about what steps you've taken to improve coordination between the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security in terms of reporting the domestic terrorism data.
Well, there were a number of places. This gets a little bit technical, but the reports that that Congress called for. I've had a number of engagements with Senator Peters and on the Senate side about this, where data about how many domestic terrorism attacks there had been and which cases there were. I think there were different ways in which the two agencies were what they were counting and so forth. So in order to kind of get better at providing that information as required by Congress, we've worked more and more closely with DHS on ensuring a common set of metrics and so forth to make sure that the reports are getting in on time and that they're complete. We still have some work to do to make them better, but I think we've made significant progress.
I appreciate it. That data is critically important, as you know. I'm just about out of time. Thanks again for your service, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.